fucked, son! Looks like you're still getting fucked up, son. Oh, Jesus Christ, boy! Boys are getting fucked, son!
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me here again today. Last week we spoke about the absolutely devastating case of Megan Creamer, and if you haven't seen that, I will link it up here for you. But that case was based around how Megan was supposedly taken from a farm where she stayed here in Cape Town and was brutally murdered. So if you haven't seen that, like I said, I'll link it up here for you. But that case is still ongoing, and we really hope that Megan's family gets the closure that they deserve. But today we are talking about a case that I wouldn't say is close to home anymore. But to me, I do think that it is something that most of us as South Africans, or even anyone over the age of 18, has experienced at least once in their life. And sadly for the Americans, I think only after the age of 21. But that is going to a nightclub. But if you have ever been to a nightclub, you know that you've seen some weird and wonderful things that happen down in the dark and dingy nightclubs that we've all gone to at least once. Often things are mostly just really entertaining with a whole lot of drunk people in one room. But this particular club that we are talking about today, I think I've only been to less than a handful of times, so maybe 3 or 4 times. And for me, I have never really enjoyed the whole vibe of this club. It's never really been something that appealed to me. And I went clubbing back in the day before this case even happened. So around about 2012, 2013. But if I put my own experience on this club, I remember it being very masculine, if that is any type of description. And in this club, the women were generally allowed to wear whatever they wanted to when they came into the club. But there were very strict dress codes for the men. So most of the men, if not all of them, had button-up shirts on and very nice pants like chinos or work pants where it's nice and neat and ironed. And they would also have on nice shoes. No sloffies, no sandals for the men, closed shoes, and you have to dress very smartly. But that's enough from my story. This case does start in the Tiger Club in Claremont. But even after a night of clubbing and having an absolute fun time with your friends, this night turned into an absolute horror for Carl Schoombie and his friends. So with that all being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
You would think the worst that could happen at a nightclub is that you get a few bumps and bruises and maybe a nice headache or hangover the next day, or as we like to call it in South Africa, a massive bubbelas. So you're partying and drinking with your friends, and all of a sudden some commotion happens on the other side of the club. You are none the wiser or even care about some guys or girls fighting in the corner of the club. You're just there to have fun with your friends. The troublemakers are taken out and you think all is right in the world again. But not for 2 unsuspecting men in November 2015. Their night would take a deadly turn. Tiger was a nightclub located in a very small section of Main Road in a suburb called Claremont. It was surrounded by other clubs, but Tiger stood out for its own reasons. It might be seen to a lot of people who were there as a place for snotty southern suburbs kids. However, it was an upscale nightclub, but affordable to a lot of people. And with Tiger, you either hate it or you love it. And like I said earlier, Tiger, the nightclub, had its fair share of bad publicity, and even besides what we are going to talk about today. So, for today's case, we are going to focus on a man named Carl Schoombie, who was incredibly loved by his friends and family. And Carl was 27 years old at the time of this incident. Carl was one of 3 children. He had a brother named Lee and a sister named Jade. After school, Carl then went to Stellenbosch University where he studied and then graduated from. And I'm not sure if Carl did this while he was studying or after he just graduated, but he was said to be a former swimming coach at a very fancy school. Carl was said to be adventurous, kind, and fun-loving. And the reason that Carl was actually back in Cape Town was that he had just come back from a trip to France. So in November of 2015, Carl and his very close friend and his very close friend's sister and her friend, they decided to all go out clubbing together. So first the 4 of them went to town to go club, and then they ended up back in Claremont where they went to Tiger. When all four of them were in Tiger, they were having fun, they were partying, they were drinking, and just having a good time. And then one of them noticed that two guys in the far end of the club started fighting. But this was nowhere near Carl and his friends, and they had no association with the people who were fighting. And what these guys were fighting about was completely unknown. So the four men that were fighting in the club, they were then split up, and two of them were chucked out the back door, and the other two were chucked out the front door, and it was the end of their night. They were done. Then almost simultaneously, Carl and his friend's sister and her friend decided to now leave the club. Four of them are now called the Uber. The Uber now arrives and they are now driving towards their respective homes. While the Uber driver is driving, he notices that someone is following him because he notices that the car behind him has very bright headlights on at the time. The Uber driver then notices this and he now tries to start snaking it through back roads to see if this car still continues to follow them. And yes, it did. Sadly, while the Uber driver was trying to get this guy off his tail, he ended up in a cul-de-sac. As soon as the Uber driver realizes that he is stuck in a cul-de-sac, he tries to turn around, and now the Uber driver is face to face or car to car with this other car with their headlights shining directly onto the Uber's car. The two guys that are in the other car get out and they then walk over to the Uber. They start banging on the windows and they say that everyone in the car must get out. So Carl and his friend get out of the car. They try and understand what's happening with this whole situation and what these guys are on about. The two suspects then went up to Carl and said, quote, "That will teach you not to fuck with us." End quote. Carl, his friend, the Uber driver, and the two ladies who are still in the car are absolutely confused about what these guys are going on about. The two men kept saying that Carl and his friend did them dirty and that they're going to make them pay. And Carl and his friend were very confused. They kept saying they had nothing to do with this. They're not sure what they are talking about. Now picture this. The Uber has now parked in a cul-de-sac. A cul-de-sac is generally a quiet street because there's only a few houses in the street. And there are two cars now facing each other. 4 to 5 men obviously shouting at each other. There's two women in the back car screaming at these men as well. Someone is going to hear what's happening. So while this whole commotion was going on, people were coming out of their houses to also see what was going to happen. But sadly, nothing could stop these two men from doing what they came there to do. It was said that one of the men punched the Uber driver square in the face and knocked him unconscious. The two men then continued to beat Carl and his friend. And remember, it is 4 a.m. in the morning and these men did just not stop beating and beating Carl. Witnesses were screaming for them to stop. The ladies in the back were screaming for them to stop and they were not having it. They just kept on beating and beating Carl. The witnesses saw that both men were almost beaten to an inch of their lives. And when they were done, the two men just got into their vehicle and drove off. The incident took place on Saturday, and eventually when the ambulance came, they took all the men to the hospital to get treated for their wounds. Carl was in a coma with severe head injuries, and there is not much said about the injuries sustained to the Uber driver or Carl's friend, but I can imagine that they were both beaten as well. But both the Uber driver and Carl's friend survived the attack. Carl fought and fought, but sadly he lost the fight the Wednesday after the attack and he died in hospital. Police were obviously contacted and they knew now that they had a murder case on their hands. And one of the police sergeants who were on the case of Carl Schoombie, his name was Captain F.C. van Wyk, and he said in a press briefing, quote, "Despite the victims continuously informing the suspects that they were not involved in the altercation at the club, the suspects continued to attack them. Schoombie was severely assaulted and sustained severe head injuries." End quote. The pathologist who examined Carl's body said that he hadn't experienced such injuries in a beating before. He said that these injuries were more likely to be from a car accident or from falling an extreme height. Now, police hit the ground running with this case, but it was a really tough one to crack because they had witnesses at the scene who could point out the people who had done this, but where and who were these people? Now, police did look at the CCTV footage that was found in the club, and they did find people on this footage. The two men identified in the surveillance footage was Brent Henry and Dwayne Jacobs. Brent was 40 years old at the time and Dwayne was 37 years old at the time. Brent Henry was a first-time offender, a father of 3 school-going children, and had a record of steady employment. Dwayne Jacobs was married, had a previous conviction, financially supported his 3 children, and played an active role in their lives. When the trial had taken place later on, his lawyer had argued that he should be considered a first-time offender because his previous convictions were a very long time ago. And as a side note, Dwayne Jacobs was actually quite well versed in mixed martial arts and in Thai boxing, and he was very good at it. But even though they both had apparently the 2 killers on tape within this club, the road to arresting them would not be as simple. Brent Henry was tracked down and he was quickly arrested, but pleaded innocent, and Dwayne Jacobs was not coming quietly, and police could not track him at all. But while police were busy searching for Dwayne Jacobs, Brent was actually in court at a bail hearing, and he was actually granted bail on 1,000 rand. Brent never ever denied that he was there, but he did deny that he was the person who laid hands on Carl.
Police believe he and Jacobs tailed and attacked 27-year-old Schoombie and his friend after mistaking them for men they'd been fighting with at the popular Tiger nightclub last November. Witnesses say the young man repeatedly tried to tell his attackers they had the wrong men, but they kept beating them, crushing his skull.
Feel good.
I'll tell you honestly, I never touched it.
You didn't touch him, is it?
My friend, but
Open.
I will, you know,
Don't talk.
and I am sorry to you loss.
Oh, well, enjoy the rest of your life in prison.
Now, Carl's family was quite disheartened by how long it was taking to find Dwayne, and also how long police were taking to get the ball rolling on this case. They were quite upset that Brent was able to get bail and that he had the ability to spend Christmas with his family. But police did put out bolos for Dwayne, and they did put a description out to the public to try and find this man. But every single month and every single day that went by, it was really, really torturous for the Schoombie family. Eventually, the police and the Schoombies' persistence paid off, and Dwayne Jacobs was arrested. Brent's bail of 1,000 rand was revoked, and both Dwayne and Brent were sent to Pollsmoor prison to await their trial. So court proceedings were going to take place on the 18th of April 2016. The court proceedings then took place in the Western Cape High Court, and the judge presiding over this case was Judge Robert Henney. And the Western Cape High Court found the evidence against Dwayne and Brent to be very overwhelming. And in the entire court proceedings, it was found that Dwayne and Brent followed this taxi into the cul-de-sac. They then set a target on Carl in a brutal and merciless attempt to assault him. They had accused him of starting trouble at the Tiger nightclub. And according to Judge Henney, he said, quote, "It seems the main aim of the accused was to kick and beat the deceased incessantly on the head and nowhere else on the body. They acted in a common purpose with premeditation and had direct intent to kill him because they aimed their blows at his head. The accused had not provided answers for how Carl could have been left beaten to a pulp on the side of the road in their presence. The evidence of his friends in the car was deemed to be credible and truthful, and I acknowledge that this is an incredibly traumatic experience for them. What is like a golden thread throughout is that all of them had seen both of the accused assaulting the deceased. The Uber driver was the only one whose testimony included how Carl was assaulted, and as the deceased lay there on the ground helpless, he was bruised, bleeding profusely through his ears, nose, and mouth, and the assailants just left him there in a helpless state. Dwayne Jacobs was found to be hitting Carl in the head with his elbow, his knees, his legs, and pressing his knee into his throat, and then continuing to beat Carl in the face with his fists. Apparently, the assailants showed absolutely no remorse for their actions, and Judge Henney said that this is a pointer as to whether someone who doesn't show remorse can actually rehabilitate if they don't show any, because it means that they don't think that they've done anything wrong. The judge also said, quote, "The first accused was given several opportunities to explain what he was sorry about when he testified in mitigation of sentence, but he refused to acknowledge that he had done wrong, but simply stated that he felt sorry for the deceased's family for the loss of their son. That is not being remorseful," end quote. Judge Henney said that the state presented an overwhelming batch of evidence against the accused, and that Judge Henny believed that there was intention to murder Carl that night. Sitting upstairs in the public gallery, 2 accused family members cried as they were handcuffed and led back to the court's holding cells. Apparently, both Brent and Dwayne showed no emotions during this time. But ultimately, in a media briefing released in 2017, the Western Cape High Court sentenced Brent Henry and Dwayne Jacobs to life imprisonment after convicting them on the charge of murder of Carl Schoombie. Brent Henry was convicted on charges of murder, assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm, and crimen injuria, which means a willful injury to someone's dignity caused by the use of obscene or racially offensive language or gestures. They sentenced Brent to life imprisonment for murder, 6 months for the assault of Carl's friend, 6 months for the assault of Carl's friend's sister, and 6 months for crime injuria against Carl's friend's sister's friend. Dwayne Jacobs was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder and was sentenced to a further 3 years in respect of the 2 assaults with intent to do grievous bodily harm. The court ordered that in respect of all the sentences, that they all be served concurrently, so that means that the men will be spending their life in prison. Judge Henny also said, quote, that the particular set of skills owned by Dwayne Jacobs made him a killing machine to be able to use his fists, elbows, knees, and shins like others use guns and knives. To kill because he was known as a skilled boxer. He had directed intention to murder Carl, and Brent, knowing this, had joined him in intending to also murder Carl. End quote. So that was the case of Carl Schoombie, and what an insane case to try and take in. How hectic is it that a case of mistaken identity led to a murder? And even if Brent and Dwayne didn't mistakenly try and murder Carl, what if they had gotten the guys that they actually intended to harm? And it's just insane that they left the club, probably being drunk, going out there with the intention to murder someone. But let me know what you think of the case down below. I hope that you are all staying safe and doing well. Thank you for all your suggestions. They are very interesting and they are so good, so keep them coming. Thank you for all your support, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.